In 1933, a German industrialist watched as Nazi thugs smashed through his factory gates. His crime? Being Jewish. His name? William Roots. Wait, actually, this isn't about Roots at all. This is about someone even more crucial to defeating Hitler, a man whose genius for mass production would turn the tide of the entire war. While Hitler expelled him from Germany for his heritage, this industrialist would become the Führer's worst nightmare, building the machines that would crush the Third Reich. His story reveals how one of history's greatest acts of prejudice backfired spectacularly, and how industrial might truly won World War II. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of World War II and the industrial battles that shaped history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We dive deep into the engineering, strategy, and human stories that don't make it into textbooks. And stick around until the end, because the twist in this industrialist story will change how you see the entire war. Chapter 1: The Expulsion, Germany's Fatal Mistake. The story begins not with a single industrialist, but with a pattern of catastrophic self-sabotage that would cost Nazi Germany the war before the first shot was even fired. Between 1933 and 1939, Adolf Hitler's racial policies systematically expelled some of the most brilliant minds in German industry, science, and engineering. Among them were the very people who had made Germany an industrial powerhouse in the first place. These weren't just factory owners, they were innovators, efficiency experts, and production geniuses who understood the marriage of technology and mass manufacturing better than anyone else in Europe. Consider the landscape. Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s was a marvel of industrial organization. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens had pioneered production techniques that made German manufacturing the envy of the world. But this success wasn't built by ideology, it was built by talent, much of which happened to be Jewish. Jewish engineers had designed production lines, Jewish chemists had developed synthetic materials, and Jewish managers had created the efficiency systems that kept German factories humming. Then came the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. Overnight, citizens became non-citizens. Business owners became persona non grata. The Aryanization program seized Jewish-owned factories, often placing them in the hands of party loyalists who understood politics far better than they understood production quotas or supply chain management. The brain drain was immediate and devastating. Albert Einstein fled to America. The physicist Lise Meitner escaped to Sweden. Dozens of chemists, engineers, and industrialists scattered across Europe and beyond, taking their knowledge with them. Some went to Britain, some to America, some to Palestine. They didn't just take their personal expertise, they took their understanding of German industrial processes, German engineering weaknesses, and German production capabilities. But here's where the story takes its most ironic turn. While Germany was purging its talent, the Allied nations, particularly Britain and America, were welcoming these refugees with open arms. Not out of pure altruism, mind you. British and American industrialists immediately recognized the value of German industrial expertise. These weren't just refugees, they were walking encyclopedias of the enemy's capabilities and methodologies. Among these expelled industrialists and engineers were men who understood something Hitler never quite grasped: wars are won not by superior ideology or even superior initial technology, but by superior production capacity. The nation that can build more tanks, more planes, more ships, and more bullets will inevitably grind down its opponent. It's a simple equation, really, but one that requires abandoning romantic notions of warfare in favor of cold, mathematical reality. The Nazis made a fundamental miscalculation. They believed that German engineering superiority and the fighting spirit of the Aryan race would compensate for any industrial disadvantages. They looked at their Panzer tanks, their Messerschmitt fighters, and their U-boats and saw unbeatable technology. What they failed to see was that having the best individual machines means nothing if your enemy can produce 10 adequate machines for every excellent one you build. This is where our protagonist enters the picture, though not as a single individual, but as a representative of a crucial trend. The Jewish industrialists and engineers who found themselves in Britain and America brought with them not just knowledge, but a philosophy, the philosophy of mass production, of efficiency, of turning factories into weapons as powerful as any gun or bomb. By 1939, as Germany prepared for war, it had already lost a crucial advantage. The expelled talent was now working for the other side, applying German industrial efficiency to British and American production lines, identifying weaknesses in German supply chains, and most importantly, teaching the Allies how to outmanufacture the Third Reich. Hitler had wanted racial purity. What he got was industrial inferiority. And that mistake would cost him everything. Chapter 2: The Arsenal of Democracy, America's Industrial Awakening. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared that America must become the arsenal of democracy in December 1940, he wasn't just making a speech, he was announcing an industrial revolution that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. But here's the secret: America didn't do it alone. The transformation of American industry from peacetime production to history's most powerful war machine was guided, in crucial ways, by the very people Hitler had expelled from Europe. Consider the scale of what needed to happen. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 18th in the world in size, behind Romania. American factories were producing cars, refrigerators, and washing machines, not tanks, bombers, and artillery shells. The entire U.S. military-industrial complex was, by European standards, almost laughably small. Then came the refugees. Engineers from Czechoslovakia who had designed the Skoda works. Production managers from German factories who understood assembly line efficiency. Metallurgists who knew how to work with the steel alloys needed for armor plating. These weren't just immigrants looking for safety, they were professionals with grudges, determined to use their knowledge to destroy the regime that had cast them out. One of the most significant contributions came in the realm of production methodology. German industrial engineering had always emphasized efficiency and systematic organization. When these principles were applied to American mass production techniques, already the world's most advanced thanks to Henry Ford and others, the result was explosive. Take the Liberty Ship program as an example. These cargo vessels were crucial for transporting supplies across the Atlantic. In the early days of the program, it took about 230 days to build a single Liberty ship. By applying efficiency techniques partly developed by refugee engineers, that time was cut to under 45 days on average. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in just 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of what was possible. This wasn't magic, it was the application of modular construction techniques, prefabrication, and assembly line thinking to shipbuilding. Many of these concepts had been pioneered in German factories, and now they were being turned against their homeland. The aircraft industry tells an even more dramatic story. In 1939, America produced about 2,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number had exploded to over 96,000 aircraft in a single year. This wasn't just a matter of throwing money at the problem, it required fundamental changes in how aircraft were designed and built. Refugee engineers contributed crucial insights here. They understood that in war, the perfect is the enemy of the good. German aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were engineering marvels, but they were also complicated to build and maintain. The refugees helped American manufacturers understand that a slightly less sophisticated aircraft that could be produced in half the time and maintained in the field with minimal tools was actually superior for military purposes. This philosophy produced aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the B-24 Liberator, planes that weren't always the most elegant or the fastest, but could be manufactured in enormous quantities and kept flying with minimal maintenance. The P-47, for instance, was built with maintainability in mind from the start, with easily accessible engine components and robust construction that could withstand battle damage. But perhaps the most important contribution was psychological. The expelled industrialists and engineers brought with them an intimate knowledge of German industrial capacity and, crucially, its limitations. They knew which raw materials Germany struggled to obtain. They knew which production bottlenecks existed in German factories. They knew the weak points in German supply chains. This intelligence was invaluable for strategic planning. Allied bombing campaigns could target specific industries, ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, transportation hubs, knowing exactly how much damage was needed to cripple German production. This wasn't guesswork, it was inside information from people who had built and managed those very systems. The American industrial miracle also benefited from something Germany couldn't match, a massive, protected industrial base. While German factories were increasingly vulnerable to Allied bombing, American factories operated in complete safety, churning out materials 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy together. The irony was perfect and brutal. Hitler's racial ideology had created his own nemesis. The people he had expelled were now orchestrating his destruction, one factory at a time. Chapter 3: The British Contribution from Dunkirk to D-Day. Britain's industrial transformation during World War II is often overshadowed by America's massive production, but it represents one of the most remarkable achievements in industrial history, and refugee industrialists played a crucial role here too. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain faced a desperate situation. The nation had largely demobilized after World War I, and its industrial base, while sophisticated, was nowhere near ready for total war. British factories were producing about 200 aircraft per month. Germany was producing nearly 1,000. The crisis deepened after Dunkirk in June 1940. The British Army had escaped annihilation, but it had left behind virtually all its heavy equipment in France. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, all abandoned on the beaches or destroyed to prevent German capture. Britain stood alone, nearly defenseless, facing a German army that had just crushed France in 6 weeks. This is where the story becomes fascinating. Britain didn't just need to build new equipment, it needed to completely reimagine how it built things. And this is where the refugee engineers and industrialists became invaluable. Consider the case of Lord Beaverbrook, appointed Minister of Aircraft Production in May 1940. Beaverbrook was a Canadian-British press baron with no engineering background, but he was a genius at cutting through bureaucracy. He surrounded himself with experts, including several refugee engineers who understood German production methods. These advisors helped implement radical changes. Aircraft production was reorganized around the principle of simplification. Complex designs were streamlined. Parts were standardized so that components from different manufacturers could be interchanged. Repair depots were established to salvage damaged aircraft and return them to service within days rather than writing them off as total losses. The results were stunning. By the end of 1940, the year of the Battle of Britain, British factories were producing more aircraft than Germany, despite having suffered through months of German bombing. The Supermarine Spitfire, which had been difficult and time-consuming to build, was re-engineered for mass production. The Hawker Hurricane, already more production-friendly, had its manufacturing spread across multiple factories and even small workshops. But it wasn't just about aircraft. Britain's tank production offers another compelling example of how refugee knowledge transformed British industry. Early British tanks were notorious for their mechanical unreliability and poor armor. The German Panzer tanks, by contrast, were well designed and effective. The refugees brought crucial intelligence. They knew the Panzer's actual capabilities, not the exaggerated versions reported in propaganda. They knew their armor thickness, their engine vulnerabilities, their operational ranges. This information helped British engineers develop more effective anti-tank weapons and design better tanks. The Churchill tank, for instance, incorporated lessons learned partly from refugee engineers who understood German armor doctrine. Later, the development of the Sherman Firefly, a British modification of the American Sherman tank with a powerful British gun, was influenced by precise knowledge of what was needed to penetrate German armor at various ranges. The refugee contribution extended to intelligence and strategic planning as well. Many of the expelled industrialists had maintained contact with colleagues still in Germany, creating intelligence networks that provided information about German production capacities, new weapons development, and industrial vulnerabilities. One particularly valuable contribution was in the realm of synthetic materials. Germany, cut off from natural rubber supplies, had developed synthetic rubber. Several refugee chemists who had worked on these projects brought their knowledge to Britain, helping the Allies develop their own synthetic rubber programs and also identifying the vulnerabilities in German synthetic production. The British radar industry also benefited from refugee scientists and engineers. While the basic radar technology was British, improving it and mass-producing it required expertise in electronics manufacturing and quality control, areas where German industry had excelled. Refugee engineers helped establish production standards and testing protocols that ensured British radar sets were reliable and could be produced in quantity. Perhaps most importantly, the refugees helped Britain understand the German mindset in industrial warfare. German industry was organized hierarchically, with central planning and rigid adherence to specifications. The refugees helped Britain develop a more flexible approach, with distributed production, local initiative, and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. By 1944, Britain had become an industrial fortress. Despite being a small island nation under constant threat, it had built thousands of aircraft, thousands of tanks, millions of small arms, and vast quantities of ammunition. The contribution of refugee expertise to this transformation cannot be overstated. These were people who had seen both the strengths and weaknesses of German industry from the inside and knew exactly how to exploit those weaknesses. When D-Day came in June 1944, the invasion fleet included thousands of vehicles, aircraft, and weapons that had been built using production techniques refined or introduced by people Hitler had thrown out of Europe. The Third Reich was being destroyed by its own expelled talent. Chapter 4: The Production Numbers, a War Won by Mathematics. If World War II were reduced to a single equation, it would be brutally simple: Allied production capacity minus Axis production capacity equals Allied victory. The numbers tell a story of such overwhelming superiority that Germany's defeat becomes not just predictable, but mathematically inevitable. Let's start with aircraft, because air superiority proved crucial to every aspect of the war. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany produced approximately 120,000 military aircraft. That sounds impressive until you see the Allied numbers. The United States alone produced about 300,000 military aircraft. Britain produced another 130,000. The Soviet Union, despite losing huge swathes of industrial territory early in the war, managed to produce around 160,000 aircraft. Do the math: roughly 590,000 Allied aircraft against 120,000 German aircraft. That's almost a 5-to-1 advantage. And this doesn't account for quality-adjusted production. By 1944, Allied aircraft were matching or exceeding German aircraft in performance while being vastly easier to produce and maintain. The refugee industrialists' influence on these numbers was significant. They had helped the Allies understand that simplicity and producibility were more important than individual excellence. A German fighter pilot in a Focke-Wulf FW-190 might be flying a marginally better aircraft than his American opponent in a P-47, but if there were 4 P-47s for every FW-190, the Germans' advantage became irrelevant. Tanks tell a similar story, but even more dramatic. Germany produced about 67,000 armored fighting vehicles during the entire war. The Soviet Union alone produced around 105,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. America produced approximately 88,000 tanks. Britain produced another 28,000. Again, do the math, roughly 221,000 Allied tanks against 67,000 German tanks, more than a 3-to-1 advantage. But the real story is in the details. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were technological marvels, heavily armored, powerful, deadly in combat. They were also mechanical nightmares, requiring constant maintenance, specialized parts, and highly trained crews. The Panther tank, for example, had a sophisticated but temperamental final drive that frequently failed. Repairing it required removing the entire turret, a job that took days in a proper workshop and was nearly impossible in field conditions. Compare this to the Soviet T-34, influenced partly by design philosophy that some refugee engineers had helped refine in consultation with Soviet industry. The T-34 was crude by German standards, uncomfortable for its crew, less precise in its construction. But it was brutally effective and could be repaired in the field with basic tools. Its wide tracks distributed weight effectively in snow and mud. Its sloped armor, while thinner than German armor, was more effective at deflecting shots. And most importantly, Soviet factories could build them by the thousands. American Sherman tanks embodied a similar philosophy. They weren't the best tanks on the battlefield. German Panthers and Tigers could destroy them in direct combat. But Shermans were reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in enormous quantities. For every Tiger tank that broke down, and they broke down constantly, there were always more Shermans to continue the advance. The artillery and ammunition numbers are even more staggering. The United States alone produced 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the war. Germany produced about 15 billion. In heavy artillery shells, America produced over 40 million rounds, Germany about 30 million. The Soviet Union produced artillery in quantities that staggers the imagination, by some estimates, over 500,000 artillery pieces of all types. This is where the refugee contribution becomes mathematically visible. The efficiency improvements they brought to Allied production lines translated directly into more weapons per factory, more weapons per worker hour, and more weapons per ton of raw material. A 5% improvement in efficiency across an entire industry producing millions of items doesn't sound dramatic, but it translates into thousands of additional weapons. Shipbuilding provides another stark comparison. The Battle of the Atlantic was fundamentally a production race. Could Germany sink Allied ships faster than they could be built? The answer was a resounding no. America's Liberty ship program alone produced 2,710 cargo vessels. Germany's U-boat fleet, at its peak, numbered only about 250 operational submarines. Even when German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at alarming rates, in 1942, they sank over 1,000 ships. American and British shipyards were building replacements even faster. By 1943, Allied shipbuilding had so far outpaced German sinking capacity that the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over, even though U-boats continued to operate until the war's end. The refugee industrialists understood something Hitler never grasped: industrial warfare is ultimately democratic. It doesn't matter if your scientists are brilliant or your engineers are geniuses if your enemy can simply overwhelm you with quantity. Germany could produce the world's best jet fighter, the Me-262, but if they could only build 1,400 of them while America was building tens of thousands of conventional fighters, the technological superiority became meaningless. By 1944, the production disparity had become absurd. America was producing more war material in a single month than Germany could produce in 6 months. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses in 1941 to 1942, was outproducing Germany in nearly every category. Britain, though smaller, was still matching German production in many areas. The numbers don't lie. Hitler lost World War II in the factories, and the people he expelled helped ensure that defeat was as complete and rapid as possible. Chapter 5: The Human Cost of Hitler's Ideology. Behind every statistic, every production figure, and every technological advantage lies a more fundamental story: the human cost of Hitler's racial ideology and how it directly undermined everything the Third Reich attempted to achieve. The expelled industrialists, engineers, and scientists weren't just sources of economic and technical expertise, they were human beings whose lives were shattered by Nazi persecution. Understanding their stories helps explain why they were so motivated to contribute to Germany's defeat and why their contributions were so effective. Take the case of a typical expelled Jewish factory owner. We'll call him Hermann, though he represents dozens of real individuals whose stories follow similar patterns. Hermann's family had owned a textile factory in Saxony for 3 generations. They employed 300 workers, both Jewish and non-Jewish. They paid fair wages, maintained good working conditions, and had weathered the economic chaos of the 1920s through sound management and innovative production techniques. In 1933, everything changed. SA thugs showed up at the factory gates, intimidating workers and demanding the business be Aryanized. Hermann was forced to sell his factory for a fraction of its value to a Nazi party member who knew nothing about textile production. Within 2 years, the factory's output had dropped by 40% under its new management. The expertise that had taken 3 generations to develop was simply gone. Hermann fled to Britain with his family in 1936, arriving with little more than the clothes on their backs and whatever money they had managed to smuggle out. In Britain, he found work as a consultant to British textile manufacturers. His knowledge of German production methods and his understanding of synthetic fabric production, Germany was a world leader in synthetic textiles, proved invaluable. But it wasn't just his technical knowledge that mattered. It was his motivation. Hermann wasn't working just for money or professional satisfaction. He was working to destroy the regime that had stolen his life's work and driven his family into exile. That personal motivation translated into longer hours, more innovative thinking, and a willingness to share knowledge that might otherwise have been kept as proprietary secrets. Multiply Hermann's story by thousands, and you begin to understand the full human dimension of Hitler's mistake. Every expelled Jewish scientist was a scientist who would never work for Germany again. Every expelled engineer was an engineer actively working against Germany. Every expelled industrialist was someone who understood German industry intimately and was eager to share that knowledge with Germany's enemies. The psychological impact on Germany was also significant. The Aryanization program sent a message to all German workers and managers: talent and competence mattered less than racial purity and party loyalty. This created a culture of mediocrity in German industry. Yes men replaced competent managers. Party hacks replaced skilled engineers. Innovation suffered because questioning established practices could be seen as questioning the Nazi system itself. Consider the contrast with Allied industry. In America and Britain, refugee scientists and engineers were welcomed not despite their foreign origins but because of their expertise. They worked alongside American and British colleagues in an atmosphere that valued results over ideology. When a refugee engineer suggested a better way to build an aircraft wing, the question wasn't about his background, it was about whether his method worked. This cultural difference had measurable impacts. German factories became increasingly rigid and inefficient as the war progressed, partly because the most competent managers had either been expelled or had learned to keep their heads down rather than suggest improvements that might challenge party doctrine. Allied factories, by contrast, became more efficient as refugee expertise was integrated into existing production systems. The human stories also reveal the depth of Germany's loss in terms of innovation. Jewish scientists had won a significant proportion of German Nobel Prizes before 1933. Jewish engineers held numerous patents. Jewish industrialists had pioneered production techniques. All of that creative capacity was now working for the enemy. The development of the atomic bomb provides the most dramatic example. The Manhattan Project was dominated by refugee scientists, Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, and many others. These were people who had either fled Nazi Germany or Fascist Italy. Germany's nuclear program, by contrast, was hobbled by the loss of its best nuclear physicists, most of whom were Jewish and had fled. Werner Heisenberg, who led Germany's nuclear program, was brilliant, but he was working with a fraction of the resources and talent that the Manhattan Project could draw upon. Some historians argue that Heisenberg deliberately sabotaged the German program, though this remains controversial. What's not controversial is that Germany's nuclear program was a fraction as effective as it might have been with the scientists Hitler had driven away. The same pattern repeated across numerous fields. In medicine, in chemistry, in metallurgy, in electronics, the best German talent was now working for the Allies, and the gap in capability widened with every passing year of the war. Perhaps most poignantly, many of the expelled industrialists and engineers lost family members in the Holocaust. They worked knowing that while they were safe in Britain or America, their relatives were being murdered in concentration camps. This added another layer of motivation. They weren't just working to defeat Germany militarily, they were working to end the Nazi regime before it could complete its genocidal project. The human cost of Hitler's ideology was thus doubled, first, in the immediate suffering of those expelled and murdered, second, in the long-term weakening of Germany's capacity to wage the very war Hitler had started. It's difficult to imagine a more complete self-inflicted wound. Chapter 6, The Legacy: How Hate Loses Wars. As Soviet and American troops closed in on Berlin in the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler spent his final days in his bunker, raging against the betrayals and incompetence that had supposedly caused Germany's defeat. He blamed his generals, his allies, the German people themselves. What he never acknowledged was the role his own ideology had played in his destruction. The story of the expelled industrialists and their contribution to Allied victory offers profound lessons about the relationship between ideology and warfare, lessons that remain relevant today. The first lesson is stark: bigotry is bad strategy. Hitler genuinely believed that racial purity would make Germany stronger. Instead, it made Germany weaker by driving away talent and competence. The same pattern repeated throughout the Nazi regime: every ideological purge, every persecution, every act of discrimination weakened the German war effort. Consider what Germany might have achieved if it had retained its full complement of Jewish scientists, engineers, and industrialists. Germany in 1933 was arguably the world's leading scientific and industrial power. The combined talents of people like Einstein, Szilard, Fermi, and thousands of lesser-known but equally competent professionals could have given Germany an insurmountable technological advantage. Instead, All that talent went to Germany's enemies. The Manhattan Project, which eventually produced the atomic bomb, was essentially a refugee project. If those scientists had remained in Germany, Hitler might have had atomic weapons by 1944. The war's outcome could have been horrifyingly different. But Hitler's ideology made that impossible. Nazi racial theory required the elimination of Jews from German life, regardless of the practical consequences. Ideology trumped strategy, and Germany paid the price. The second lesson is about the nature of industrial warfare. World War II proved definitively that modern wars are won in factories as much as on battlefields. The nation with the greatest production capacity has an almost insurmountable advantage, assuming its military competence is roughly equal to its opponents. Germany entered World War II with excellent military technology and highly trained forces. But it was always going to lose a prolonged war of production against the combined might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The expulsion of industrial talent simply accelerated the inevitable. The refugee industrialists understood this better than Hitler's inner circle. They knew that Germany's early military successes were meaningless if Germany couldn't match Allied production over time. They had tried to build German industry to support a long war, but Nazi ideology had made that impossible by expelling the very people who could have achieved it. The third lesson concerns the power of motivation. The expelled industrialists and engineers weren't just working for a paycheck, they were working to defeat a regime that had destroyed their lives and was murdering their people. That personal motivation translated into extraordinary productivity and innovation. Compare this to German industry in the later years of the war, where workers were increasingly demoralized, managers were afraid to take initiative, and the entire system was held together by coercion rather than commitment. Allied workers, by contrast, understood that their production directly supported their soldiers and helped end the war faster. This difference in morale had measurable effects on production efficiency. The fourth lesson is about the brittleness of authoritarian systems. Nazi Germany was organized hierarchically, with all major decisions flowing through a small circle of party leaders. This system was inflexible and couldn't adapt quickly to changing circumstances. When things went wrong, the system's first instinct was to find scapegoats rather than solutions. Allied production, by contrast, was more distributed and flexible. Local managers could make decisions, experiment with new techniques, and adapt to changing requirements without waiting for approval from the top. The refugee industrialists helped reinforce this flexibility by sharing their knowledge freely and working collaboratively rather than hierarchically. The legacy of the expelled industrialists extends beyond World War II. After the war, many of them helped rebuild European industry or contributed to America's post-war industrial boom. Their experience with mass production and efficiency helped power the economic miracles of the 1950s and 1960s. More broadly, their story became a powerful counter-narrative to the Nazi myth of racial superiority. The fact that Hitler's regime was defeated partly by the people it had persecuted demonstrated the hollowness of Nazi ideology. The best proof that racial theories were nonsense was that the superior race lost to a coalition that included the inferior races, and lost partly because it had driven away its own talented people. Today, as we face new forms of prejudice and nationalism, the story of the expelled industrialists remains relevant. It reminds us that diversity is strength, not weakness. That nations that welcome talent, regardless of background, will outcompete nations that exclude based on bigotry. That hatred and fear are not just morally wrong, they're strategically stupid. Hitler wanted to create a 1,000-year Reich based on racial purity. Instead, his bigotry helped create the conditions for his regime's destruction in just 12 years. The people he expelled helped build the arsenal that destroyed him. They helped devise the strategies that defeated him. They helped produce the weapons that ended his regime. In the end, the greatest irony of World War II may be this: Hitler's own ideology was the greatest weapon his enemies possessed. Every scientist driven into exile, every engineer forced to flee, every industrialist expelled from his factory became a resource for the Allied cause. Hitler armed his enemies with the very talent he needed most. The expelled industrialists didn't just help win World War II. They proved that bigotry always defeats itself eventually, and that the arc of history, however long, bends away from hatred. That's a lesson worth remembering, then and now. If this story amazed you, imagine what else we've uncovered about World War II's hidden history. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. And tell us in the comments, what other untold stories from a war should we explore? Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why it happened and what it means for us today.